the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. Live from the Greene Space today. And I'll say first off that when we're live in the Greene Space, you can watch the Brian Lehrer Show as well as listen to it because we stream live video on our website. You can just go to WNYC.org. Might be on the homepage, or you might have to go to WNYC.org/thegreenspace. Either way, if you want to watch the show, for those of you watching already, I'm waving. Hi. And anybody else can watch the Brian Lehrer Show today as well as listen. We have a great lineup of guests. Katie Couric will be here on the really challenging series on difficult questions that she's doing on television with National Geographic. Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign manager, Jeff Weaver, will be here. He wrote a book called How Bernie Won. I know he lost. But we'll talk about 2016 and 2018 and 2020. And we continue our series, The Eights, A Brief History of the Culture Wars, Decade by Decade. Today we continue on in 1968 with historian Peniel Joseph and others on the rise of the Black Power movement and how white backlash helped elect Richard Nixon president. We'll also include the 1968 Columbia University protests in black and white as part of that conversation. But we begin today with one of the most important journalists and journalism executives in the country today, Ben Smith, editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed. Now, far from its early reputation as the place for articles like 23 cat pictures you won't be able to resist, BuzzFeed News has also become a force for original and investigative reporting, news analysis, publishing the Steele dossier before anyone else thought that was an okay thing to do, and more. Ben Smith, who has New York roots, coming up at the Daily News and elsewhere in journalism, has been writing articles himself on the site too. Not every editor-in-chief does that, but good ones, including why corruption rather than collusion might be more likely to be Donald Trump's undoing, why Facebook is like a mid-20th century European colonial power, why it's...
That wasn't the headline.
I'll have to ask you about that one. What?
I said that was not the headline.
No, but that was your theme. Why it's Christmas for neocons now in the Trump administration. That was the headline. And a really great and humble read on mistakes that Ben made as a young reporter in Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union and what they taught him about America and the world today. So hi, Ben Smith. Welcome back to WNYC and welcome to the Greene Space.
Yeah, thank you for having me on with all your super fans here.
So I actually want to start with your reminiscence about reporting from Belarus in 2001 because it actually does so much to reveal truths, I think, about the Trumpian and Putinian world of today. You write that as a child of the 1990s, you had assumptions about the arc of history that made you a bad reporter. Very candid. Can you set the scene for us?
Yeah, it was in back then the European Union and NATO were expanding inexorably eastward through Europe. There was a narrative, which by then, if you look closely, was nonsense in retrospect, that Russia was on this kind of rocky but inevitable path toward free markets and democracy. And Belarus was this funny little island of almost sort of comic Soviet-style governance that hadn't really had held on to this centralized economy and authoritarian state, really as in part because the people there saw Ukraine and Russia kind of deteriorating into anarchy around them and clung to this authoritarian dictator who was this, and still today is, this giant former collective farm boss called Alexander Lukashenko, who, again, feels like a caricature of an Eastern European autocrat.
So that what you just referred to, it was a very telling line for me in the article that liberals imagine Belarus as the next Poland, a post-communist success story. But people in Belarus were looking more to Ukraine as kind of a cautionary tale. And Ukraine, of course, cycles back around to be a Paul Manafort connection. Did Trump change the platform because of Russian collusion, or they have something on him, that kind of influence. So here we are with Ukraine as kind of playing the central role in how we think about Donald Trump. Explain the context of looking to Ukraine rather than looking to Poland to understand what the world was going to become.
Right. Well, the post-Soviet countries, other than the Baltics, were basically in varying degrees taken over by former communist leaders who were privatized state assets into their own hands. The safety net fell apart without a real dynamic market economy emerging, and without a sense that all boats were being lifted.
So does that relate to the tolerance or appetite even that people have for authoritarian leaders today, including Putin, including whose name I forgot already, that still head of Belarus? How many terms is he in?
I think he's in his 6th term. He recently remarked there was some criticism of him because he's just incredible. He's very traditionalist, let's say, on the issues of marriage, that well, at least it is better to be a dictator than to be gay. That's his recent, when he was accused of being a dictator.
As you can tell, I haven't followed Belarusian presidential politics
but
very
yeah,
much.
I think that's certainly part of, I think in that particular place, I think for each of them, Putin has a very different appeal, I think, in Russia. In Belarus, yeah, it's very much about stability. It's about look to the east, look to the south. There's now a shooting war in Ukraine. Nobody says, wow, I wish our country were like Ukraine right now.
And even Trump, right, with part of his base not really caring that he acts like an autocrat in various ways?
I don't know. I think it's hard to draw these analogies, honestly.
Your mildly sneering article back then about what you thought was just a bad communist tractor factory. This was an article you wrote in the Wall Street Journal. You called it a tractor in every pot. What did you think you were seeing, and what did you learn years later that it really was?
Yeah, so this was, when you work for the Wall Street Journal, and I was a stringer. I was the least important sort of semi-employee of the entire Dow Jones empire. But your goal is to write stories that people who, are on Wall Street read and are amused by, and kind of sometimes display the follies of people who are resisting this inevitable march of capitalism in kind of a good-hearted, gentle way. And so I sort of found one of these stories in this tractor factory in Minsk. I think it's the tractor factory in the name of Lenin. I think it's still called that. And that was producing so many tractors that they were plowing the streets with tractors, and there were tractors sitting unused on collective farms because they couldn't afford the diesel to power the tractors, and were in fact using horses to plow the fields. And then when I went to the factory to interview them, they were incredibly paranoid and sort of defensive about not telling me. And usually you're a Wall Street Journal reporter, you walk into a business, they're very eager to tell you what's going on. Here they were sort of very secretive about it, and I portrayed them as these kind of Soviet goons who didn't know what they were doing at running this incompetent centralized economy. A few years later, around the Iraq War, a guy named Charles Dolfer wrote this quite detailed report into the arms trade to Iraq and elsewhere, and became clear that Belarus in general, this factory in particular, were major global sources for missile launchers to rogue regimes. And I had totally missed the story, totally misunderstood why they were being secretive.
It's a fascinating lesson. It really is. And last thing about this, you reported a scoop back then on American cash helping to influence the direction of Eastern Europe at that time. And what that made me think of in terms of today, and tell me if you think this one was a leap, like you thought for some reason that Trump's base being tolerant of his authoritarianism was a leap to compare it to in Eastern Europe. But what was that? And does it make you look at the issue of Russian meddling in our elections any differently today, to know that we were meddling with cash money flowing into other people's elections at that time?
Let's see. I was talking to this young activist, and there was this kind of slick new grassroots activist group with great stickers and branding that was had based itself on the Serbian resistance. And he just mentioned to me offhand he'd go into Poland every month and pick up a suitcase full of cash from the Americans, and that's how they were funding the movement. And I put it into print because it was a good scoop, and got yelled at by the embassy and told that that this poor kid had been imprisoned and beaten because of my reporting, and which is something I carried for a long time and thought about for a long time. I don't know.
And it turned out you were lied to by the American official. The kid was not imprisoned and beaten, right?
Yeah, I finally looked him up, and he's working in a hotel in Prague, and he said, no, they never put me in jail.
And there you've carried that guilt for, almost 2 decades, and then you learned that it was the American official who was lying to you, and it wasn't the communist officials who really did the bad thing.
They later beat him up, and he left the country. There's not a lot of, nobody looks great here.
But you didn't.
But
here we are,
certainly
meddling all over the country, all over the world,
all over the world, and always have. I think you can. two ways to see it. Like, we were in fact meddling to support the democratic aspirations of people who were living under an authoritarian regime. I mean, I think that's I don't think the analogy is exact. On the other hand, you see why people around the world roll their eyes when we complain.
My guest is the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed, Ben Smith, here in the Greene Space on the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. We can take phone calls for Ben Smith on anything you've read on BuzzFeed, or we'll get into some news of today as well. So we can be pretty broad here. Listeners, if you want to call in, 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692, or just raise your hand here in the Greene Space. So you published the Steele dossier at BuzzFeed when other news organizations, or maybe it was just CNN that also had it originally, remind me, would only describe it because of its salacious but unverified content about Trump and prostitutes in Russia and other unverified content. Can you take us back to the decision and tell us if it was a close call?
Yeah, there were a number of news organizations, including us, had it for a period of months or of weeks, and we all saw it as a really interesting lead, and we're chasing and trying to confirm or knock down various aspects of it. Had reporters, outside the Ritz-Carlton or in various other places. What changed the day we published it, right, is that CNN reported that this dossier existed, that it contained, in broad terms, potentially compromising information about the president and allegations of collusion, but we're not going to show it to you. We think it might scald your eyes out if you actually see this thing. So we're just going to sort of leave the innuendo hanging there, which I think it seemed to me, and just in this, that in a totally different media age where you have strong gatekeepers who totally control the flow of information, maybe there's an argument for acting like that. I think today, where people expect to trust but verify their media sources, we felt that it was not that it was the right thing to do, to share the underlying document with our audience.
Let people see it.
And this was, and particularly what CNN reported was that this document had been briefed to two presidents of the United States, that this document was being fought over at the highest levels of the U.S. government. And I think, at the time, incredibly controversial decision. Everybody yelled at us for a couple of days. The president called us a failing pile of garbage. A year later, I'm not actually sure anybody thinks it was the wrong move. And, I think it'd be hard if you look back at this year, like the fights between Devin Nunes and Adam Schiff over things that would be totally impossible to understand what the hell was going on if you didn't have the dossier.
Right. And I supported you on the air at the time. And I felt like, who are we as journalists to decide that the public can't see this thing if we have it and we're describing it? Anyway, what did Trump call you?
A failing pile of garbage.
So was that like...
I would say that's inaccurate.
But was it good for business, bad for business, or neither?
I think the jury is still out on that. I mean, I think our audience obviously appreciated the fact that we were being straightforward, that we're being straightforward with people. I think that is very much who we are as a news organization, that we are, our impulse is to, and partly I think because, we're called BuzzFeed, we don't have a 100-year-old brand. We can't just expect you to trust us based because you recognize our masthead. We expect you to trust us because we can prove that what we're saying is true, because we're sharing the documents, because we're being as open in our reporting as we can. So that is certainly part of how we think about the world, and maybe part of how we have to. I think the question of how Trump has affected media businesses, I think he likes to say that he's the best thing that ever happened to media. I think, he's this incredibly polarizing figure, and everything in every media property in some sense exists in relation to him. And I think that in its way is sort of a trap. And we certainly don't see ourselves as opposition media or as existing in relation to Donald Trump. How
do you see BuzzFeed overall in the media ecosystem?
I think we see ourselves as, an aggressive news reporting operation that's really independent and has real journalistic chops, and that I don't think we aren't a sort of a generational, we aren't, when people talk about news for younger people or for millennials, that sometimes means, short words and big pictures and, like this kind of, this eternal stereotype that young people have short attention spans. I think for us it means that we're focused on news stories, like, whether it's the rise of the alt-right or the Me Too movement. important news stories, but probably that a lot of our reporting resources are put into the Facebook story rather than the railroad pension story, for instance.
Yeah. You wrote an article about how corruption rather than Russia or racism is more likely to be Trump's undoing, if anything is. Why do you have that theory?
Yeah, I don't know. That was 3 weeks ago. I'm not sure I still believe that, but I do think I do think that for people who are most the sort of resistance, people who are most committed to, who are most disturbed by the Trump administration, and for people who think about political science and the big picture, corruption is really the least of it. I mean, there's this idea that he's got some strange connection to the Russians, that he's eroding the fabric of civil society and of American life, and by sort of really being incredibly divisive. I think when you look at what actually brings down leaders, I mean, I think if you look at Netanyahu in Israel right now, for instance, it is often the cash in the bag. I mean, it is often I think if you look at actually in this state, if you look at Albany right now, it's not misgovernance that brings people down. Often it is very, very often very simple to understand. Often not that. It doesn't have to be that much money transaction which a public servant is enriching themselves. And I think you see that happening all over the place right now.
Let's take a phone call. Here on line 5 is Vincent in Mill Neck. You're on WNYC, Vincent, with Ben Smith from BuzzFeed. Hi.
Good morning, Brian. Good morning, Ben. I have a simple question. I guess, do you feel that the mainstream news outlets need to have a consequence to not sourcing or proper vetting of their stories? I mean, if you look at the example of Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, our president made a joke on Saturday Night Live about not finding them, yet hundreds of thousands of people died. I mean, we live in a society, Brian, that they can't even tell or see the geoengineering programs that exist over their heads. How are they going to believe something that's in another continent? I'm
not sure what that geoengineering
I'm going to skip the geoengineering part of that question, if you don't mind. But I think, right? I mean, I think did the Times? I mean, the Times obviously had this incredible reckoning with itself over its handling of the Iraq War. I think one virtue of the Trump administration is that news organizations that used to be pretty captive to official administration sources and Washington sources have a healthily adversarial relationship with the White House. I mean, I think probably we should have had that, and at our best did have that kind of relationship with the Obama White House or the Clinton White House or the Bush White House. I mean, I do think there's this kind of, particularly this kind of foreign reporting where what you're really reporting on is arguments among White House officials and State Department officials that are 2 or 3 degrees removed from reality, and that's always a real trap.
Thursday is the 1-year anniversary of the Mueller investigation. We seem to be headed for Trump using that anniversary for something. Have a sense of what that will be? Like, is a constitutional crisis now 2 days away or something less than that?
I mean, I think that, the reporting suggests that Donald Trump wakes up every morning and decides what he's going to do that day. So I'm not sure that I can speak. I think it's very hard to predict.
You wrote an article called Trump Brings Christmas for Neocons, with the appointments of John Bolton as National Security Advisor and Pompeo as Secretary of State. What does Christmas for Neocons mean?
Christmas for Neocons was what one of my old neocon sources called it. And I think just when you look at the cast of this administration's foreign policy, it's really the first Bush administration. It's not even it's the sort of Rumsfeld, Cheney. I mean, probably Dick Cheney is the guiding spirit of the current foreign policy, to the extent the guiding spirit is not reality show sort of attention-getting reaction, because there's a lot of that too, but a kind of nationalism without a lot of interest in democracy, which was sort of a strand, and maybe neocon isn't quite the right word for that strand of the Cheney wing.
So the aggressive Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld cowboy attitude, if you want, as critics used to call it, that ended their term with really pathetic approval ratings by Democrats and Republicans alike, is back. Didn't Trump run against exactly that?
Yes, he ran against exactly that by name, and claimed to have opposed the Iraq War, even though he didn't.
Right. He just wants to look tough because that's his brand, or looking like the un-Obama, like undoing the Iran deal and bringing in Bolton, in particular, is more important to his media strategy than looking like the un-Bush?
One lens of this is just right, that he's doing the opposite of whatever Obama is doing. And I think, and you look at North Korea, there's an opening that he has found where Obama was not able to. Iran is the opposite. That's certainly one way to look at it. I think there's also a sort of chest-thumping nationalism that is as much a style as an ideology that is pretty central to both the early Bush years and the current administration.
And now Trump has tweeted that he's going to let off the hook a gigantic Chinese telecom company, ZTE, that violated, in particular, our sanctions on Iran, and that Trump's own Commerce Department and Obama's before it had punished for doing so. Do you understand what's going on there? Because I have no idea.
I mean, I've read a lot about it. I mean, and it is a wild situation, and I think there are two plausible explanations. One is something happened there that we have no idea what's going on. There's some transaction happening in the background that explains this otherwise inexplicable situation. The other is that Trump is trying to do a deal with the Chinese and do kind of a grand bargain that covers every single aspect of conflict, and this is one of them. And he is ignoring Justice Department policy and guidelines to try to make that deal. It does seem like he's offering. I mean, he's sort of offering an element of that deal in advance of getting anything in return, which seems strange. But it's a little. But I think in these kind of, it's hard. I think it's, as often is true in this administration, pretty hard to figure out what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, on the other hand, there could be a benign explanation along the lines of what you're saying, some kind of deal that either has to do with trade or maybe has to do with North Korea, where, I mean, we want our president to be a negotiator, right? He ran as the ultimate deal maker, but he really seems like he's the ultimate just scream at your enemies and build that narrative of, I'm whooping the bad guys or being tough on the bad guys with my words. We actually want him to make deals that might involve giving something as well as taking something.
After I was in a small group of reporters talking to the French president after he met with Trump 2 weeks ago, and his point of view was he's trying to create crises in order to create sort of the conditions for a deal, and that it's a very risky way to get a deal, but potentially a good one.
We have a question here in the Greene Space. Hi.
Hi. With regards to this, I had read either this in the New York Times or CNN that one of the aspects of this ZTE deal is that China is going to invest something like $500 million in some Trump enterprise.
There's a hotel. There's some kind of luxury hotel complex in Indonesia with Trump's name on it that a couple of days ago received a grant from a state-backed Chinese bank. Yes. I mean, I don't know.
Okay. Let's go. Let's see. We're going to go to line 6, which is David in Brooklyn. And I think this is David Yaski.
Wait, really?
From
Councilman,
or or former councilman. Hi, David.
Hey, Brian, and hello, Mr. Smith.
And you're on with, by the way, for listeners just tuning in, the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed, Ben Smith. Now, David, let's see. Remind me, you're out of the council now, right?
I am. I'm in academia, and although I remember when Ben Smith was a young City Hall reporter and was an extraordinarily insightful and sophisticated reporter, and if I was smarter, I would have bought stock in him at that very point, because the talent was obvious. But my question is, as somebody who consumes a lot of journalism, and I realize more than ever that investigative or kind of deep dive journalism is so essential. How do you think it's going to continue in an era where I also expect to read things for free? Have you guys, is BuzzFeed the solution, or are there many solutions?
Nice to hear from you, David. Thank you for the kind words. And I mean, it's something, of course, that we think about all the time. I mean, I think and hope there are a lot of solutions. I think, you see the New York Times and the Washington Post building really impressive subscription businesses, people paying for their journalism. That's an incredibly healthy sign. That also, though, means that if you are one of the, even, imagine if they get 1% of the American population, or say 2%, that's a great subscription business. That is 98% of people who can't read their publications. And I think from our perspective, our sort of mission is, and very much in our DNA, is serving kind of the open internet and serving anybody and everybody. And so we are, I think, would like to avoid going behind a paywall. The advertising business is historically a great business associated with journalism. It has its ups and downs, but we have a really strong advertising business, and we've also been, the media business is actually very complicated and boring, basically, but have been, getting into a lot of other businesses lately as well, including television. I think, in terms of investigative journalism, we've certainly found over maybe just the last few years that just the sheer volume of stuff being thrown on the internet, to me, I think is actually starting to diminish, and the appetite for quality and the ability of the platforms to get you the quality news is going up. I mean, yesterday, a biggest story on our website was this incredible oral history of the congressional shooting last year. Really kind of deep, rich reporting, great writing.
The one on the baseball field where Steve Scalise got
you
so
almost
badly
had
wounded.
It was almost the biggest political assassination in American history. This incredibly near miss that kind of got memory hold in this news cycle today. But but it was pretty heartening to see that was the story that was being most widely distributed and shared. And so I actually think that in this kind of noisy, cluttered environment, people are increasingly looking for and increasingly able to find quality.
Another question from here in the Greene Space. Hi there.
Hi, I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how much chaos is there in Washington? I mean, from your sources, is this just crazy chaos like we're thinking it might be, or is it still kind of normal?
So like when those Department of Homeland Security color chart, it's like orange, I think. I think that, this really is, Obama at some point said that he was running the most transparent administration in history. This is undoubtedly the most transparent administration in modern history. They leak constantly. Axios had a great piece yesterday about sort of interviewing leakers about why they leaked. I mean, I think what you read, what Maggie Haberman's reporting every day is basically it. Yeah, it's a entertainment figure running a sort of a reactive television presidency.
Before you go, I said I was going to get your article called "What Comes After the Social Media Empires," and relevant to the previous questioner about models in journalism and so forth. But in this article, you compared Facebook and some other social media giants to a mid-20th century European power, basically agonizing over the loss of its colonies around the world. That's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, you really liked that one, didn't you? I think basically what you see with Facebook and YouTube right now, in particular, and Twitter, is they took all this real estate, they took over all these areas of the culture, and now we're sort of saying, like, wait, it's really not worth what it costs us to hold on to certain of these territories. We're going to let I think yesterday we had a story on how the kind of weed YouTube community got kind of forced off the site. Advertisers don't want it. It's sort of too much trouble. People who make videos about guns, all sorts of distasteful political elements that they find politically distasteful. Essentially, news in general is getting pushed off Facebook to some degree. And so I think you're seeing them sort of give back elements of all this land they've taken. And that, in some ways, at the fringes, is leaving space for new social media platforms to emerge, new smaller group communications in a way that is right now, very much confined to the fringes. They're the gun tubers, sex workers who got tossed off the internet in this kind of recent crackdown on prostitution, are sort of have moved on to these Mastodon, which is a Twitter alternative. There's I think you're seeing people, the kind of weed community, which is, by the way, legal in a lot of the country now, move on to different social media platforms. Those are like classic fringe communities, but I think you are seeing a bit of splintering after, 5 years of real consolidation.
And then where does that go? I mean, that could be good or bad, right? Either really dangerous stuff, like if they can really police fake news, which I'm not sure if they can really discern real from fake somewhere in Facebook headquarters. But, if the original utopian vision of the internet, especially the sharing internet as opposed to the searching internet, was that people would be passing around political content as well as personal content, and there would be more awareness of the world in general, and that's given way to this dystopian vision of the social media world. But I don't want information to stop flowing either that's issue-oriented.
Right. I mean, I think that Facebook in particular rose with this vision to connect the world, and they weren't thinking, well, we're also going to connect ISIS. I mean, they saw it as a sort of moral positive to connect people. I think what's become clear is, well, you connect different kinds of people. I think Facebook is very committed to trying to throw ISIS off there, and there are executives that members of Congress can yell at if they find ISIS postings. As you move toward encrypted and or decentralized social media platforms with maybe no executives and maybe no way to see into them. I mean, that's already true on, for instance, WhatsApp, where in India in particular, WhatsApp is the main platform for the spread of fake news, what we call fake news. And it's encrypted. There's no, we can't look into other people's groups and say, and the government can't, and WhatsApp can't. So I think that we may look back at the 2016 election and say, wow, that was great. I wish it was like that.
Please thank Ben Smith, editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed.
Thank you.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the Greene Space. Katie Couric right after this.
At WNYC, we're thankful for our sustaining members, thousands of listeners who contribute to WNYC every month. If you're already a sustainer, thank you. Your ongoing monthly support is what allows WNYC to bring you the fearless journalism that is so vital to our democracy. Not a sustaining member yet? Become one today by calling 888-376-WNYC or visit WNYC.org and click on Donate.
WNYC supporters include Juilliard, providing one-day summer intensive courses for adults of all ages and abilities. Topics range from Bach to the Beatles and are taught by distinguished Juilliard faculty. Registration at juilliard.edu/summer series. The Cash App, a mobile platform for sending and receiving money for both personal and business transactions. Through the Cash App, payments can be deposited directly to bank accounts. The Cash App is available in the App Store and Google Play. Support for the Greene Space, WNYC's street-level state-of-the-art events venue and broadcast studio at 44 Charlton Street, is provided by the Jerome L. Greene Foundation.
This is WNYC, 93.9 FM and AM 820, NPR News and the New York Conversation.
WNYC, live in the Greene Space today. And listeners, when we're in the Greene Space, you can watch the Brian Lehrer Show as well as listen, because we stream live video. You can get it at WNYC.org. You can get it on our Facebook page. That's WNYC's Facebook page, or the Greene Space. .org. That's Green with an E at the end, thegreenspace.org, or WNYC's Facebook page, or it's probably streaming right on the homepage at WNYC.org if you want to watch live streaming video of our show today. And for American households, there is probably no face or voice in American journalism more recognizable than those of our next guest. Katie Couric is America's anchorwoman, an award-winning journalist who broke the glass ceiling for women in network news, among many other things that she has done. In a new docuseries, America Inside Out, produced with National Geographic for the National Geographic Channel, Couric journeys through dozens of towns and cities, talking to people one-on-one, and is focused on, this is a tough assignment that you took on, Katie.
I know,
You
I'm
focus
crazy.
on heated and divisive topics. Welcome back to WNYC.
Nice to see you, Brian. I wore a green dress for the Greene Space. Very green. It's like a highlighter green.
That's right. That's right. A gentle, bright kind of lime. You said it better than me. Highlighter green. Katie Couric, correspondent and executive producer of America Inside Out. And you dive into some really controversial conversations. There's an episode on white anxiety. One is called The Muslim Next Door. One episode you explore the world of robot dating and gender inequality, among other things. We'll get to the robot dating, but how did you
Confederate
settle?
iconography and the whole debate over Confederate statues. And as someone who loves history and went to the University of Virginia and was in Charlottesville for that horrendous rally last August, that's one that's particularly near and dear to my heart as well.
So you went back there, and did you learn anything new about Charlottesville or that whole series of incidents that has not already been well digested by anybody and, divided them up into their camps?
Yeah, I mean, I learned a lot in exploring sort of this whole notion of how we commemorate history and what historical figures we choose to idolize or we have chosen to idolize throughout history. And of course, I talked to the 16-year-old high school student who started the petition to take down the Robert E. Lee statue in the middle of Charlottesville. And I talked to Don Gathers, who started the Black Lives Matter movement in Charlottesville, as well as history professors who are experts on the Civil War. And I learned a tremendous amount. It's embarrassing for me. I was an American Studies major, Brian, and there's there's so much about the Civil War and American history that I realized I wasn't taught, and I think many people in this room and listeners were not taught, and that is, this whole notion of the lost cause narrative that romanticizes the Confederacy and disputes the notion that slavery was at the heart of the Civil War, and how that, through popular culture and movies like Gone with the Wind, has had a tremendous hold on the psyche of so many Americans. The fact that many of these Confederate monuments and memorials were placed at the height of the Jim Crow era. The Southern Poverty Law Center did a big survey, and many of them were put in the early 1900s and 1920, including the one in Charlottesville. The Robert E. Lee statue was placed after a KKK rally had taken place, and Birth of a Nation was showing in the local Charlottesville movie theater. And of course, many schools were named after Confederate icons, quote unquote, after Brown v. Board of Education as an affront to African Americans in this country. And when I tell my friends who feel very strongly that the statue should remain in public spaces, and I give them more historical context and perspective, oftentimes they say, gee, I never thought of it that way, or I never knew that. And this really was the purpose of this series, is to give people greater context and perspective on these very incendiary issues that people have strong knee-jerk reactions to and can spout whatever they want to on social media and act with authority. But really, when it comes down to it, people have opinions without much portfolio. So I wanted to provide the information they would need, and if they have the same opinion, that's fine, but at least it will be an informed opinion.
Now, tomorrow, I believe, is the final episode in the series,
yeah,
right? Called The Age of Outrage.
Right.
And you look at what some people call PC culture on college campuses, but I think it's a really interesting take to frame it in terms of outrage. So what did you go looking for and what did you find?
Well, I just thought it was so interesting how we're looking at the world quite differently. I have a daughter who's graduating from college next month. I have another daughter who's 26. And I saw this very strong shift in how we look at different cultures, whether it's, and all this new lingo that wasn't around, in the dark ages when I was in college. When you think about things like safe spaces, trigger warnings, microaggressions, terms like white privilege or cultural appropriation. I thought, gee, this is a very different way of sort of relating to the world and relating to popular culture. And I wanted to better understand it. So I went to Northwestern and the University of Chicago, where they have very distinct, very differing points of view in terms of how they approach these things. Morty Shapiro, who's the president of Northwestern, who I knew because I gave the commencement address at Williams, where he was president before Northwestern, said you have to be comfortable to engage in uncomfortable learning. Whereas Robert Zimmer, the president of the University of Chicago, feels very strongly that we do not have intellectual safe spaces, microaggressions, trigger warnings, and there's no platforming. And so no platforming is when a speaker gets drowned out or unable to speak at a college or university. So these were all kind of complicated, thorny issues, and I just kind of wanted to get underneath the surface of all these things and give people the information about sort of how two different colleges are reacting. But in addition to that, Brian, I talked about cultural appropriation in fashion, for example.
Let me cut in only because
Sure.
we have a clip from exactly that section.
Oh, okay. Perfect.
So which school were Joe and Elaine at? Do you remember?
Okay. Elaine Welteroth was the editor of Teen Vogue, and she is sort of, I think, a national expert, if you will, on cultural appropriation, and was trying to explain why, when sort of fashion designers and other people take sort of imagery or customs from other cultures, co-opt them and claim them as their own, why that is so offensive to marginalized communities.
All right. So this is a dialogue between two people, including her, on.
Oh,
this.
and Josie is a fashion writer and editor. Josie, sorry. And Joe thinks it's sort of been taken too far. And it was very interesting, by the way, to see this play out at the Met Gala. I wondered why more Catholics weren't up in arms about this, because if you're talking about cultural appropriation, I mean, that was sort of a case study in cultural appropriation.
Remind me, what happened?
Were they all dressed in sort of Catholic garb, or sort of, with a lot of sort of religious imagery based. I haven't seen the exhibit yet, and I wasn't at the Met Ball, but it was very, very religious sort of imagery in the outfits. It was crazy, like Sarah Jessica Parker wore a nativity scene on her head, and there were a lot of sort of very saintly looking headgear situations.
So in this clip, Joe speaks first, Elaine speaks second.
If we start to put the label on top of everything, because yes, we can definitely dig and find appropriation in almost everything, we're going to lose the creativity of what this industry is about.
You've seen Miley Cyrus come out in gold teeth and cornrows, and she's twerking on a stage, and suddenly that goes viral, and it's something that seems cool, and that's something that is being borrowed from a culture that has been oppressed and marginalized for generations. We have to examine why something becomes valid when a white person deems it wearable.
So we will hear those clips in tomorrow night's show.
That's right. And hopefully this series will have a long tail. If people miss it, tomorrow it's on Hulu, and it's on YouTube and Apple Television and Facebook and everywhere else you can imagine. Because, it's been great. The people who have watched it it's designed to be a conversation starter too, to be able to continue the discussion. But I thought that, that's just an interesting example of something that people often feel very strongly about, which is this whole idea of cultural appropriation. But to have someone like Elaine explain that, that fashion, for example, has traditionally cut itself off from minorities, and not really there hasn't been an equal opportunity or a seat at the table for many minorities. And what her point is, when white people then start wearing certain fashions, they become beautiful and valid and acceptable, and as she said, wearable, where it's been part of Black culture and not considered that way and looked at very differently. So, it's very eye-opening conversations. My husband thinks the series may be too smart, but I don't think so.
And Control Room, we're going to go ahead to clip 3. See, this is the kind of behind-the-scenes thing that when we're not in the Greene Space, I could just say in an intercom, but I don't have that luxury here. So I
like the transparency, Brian.
We're going to go to clip 3 in a second, because as if that conversation about appropriation wasn't fraught enough, you sat down and had dinner with some extremely controversial people on race and gender issues, people some believe shouldn't be given a platform. You interviewed Charles Murray, author of The Bell Curve, which suggested in that book back in the 90s that black people are less intelligent on average. Jordan Kessler, the white nationalist leader behind the Charlottesville white nationalist rally, as you said before, and former Google employee James Damore, who wrote the Google Manifesto, so-called, which claimed that gender pay gap is a myth. So here's a little excerpt of your conversation with James Damore. He speaks first.
They assume that all of that gap is due to discrimination against women, when some of it may be due to simply them not being interested as much as men on average are.
People went crazy over your manifesto,
Right.
to say the least, and they found it incredibly offensive, suggesting that women didn't have the capacity to excel in science, engineering.
Right. So I never talked about capabilities or aptitude. It was really about preference. They assume that there is this bias against women, and so they try to correct for it. But in some cases, they may overcorrect.
So this conversation really takes place on two levels. One is the content that you're talking to him about. The other is the concept of no platforming. And should people like him or Charles Murray even be given a platform to have a conversation with Katie Couric on national television, right?
Oh, well, I have no problem trying to understand a controversial figure and where they're coming from. So I think if we shut those people out and not hear their point of view, and I guess that's the argument against no platforming too, that, if, I think it's really hard when you talk about people with really repugnant views, would you invite Adolf Hitler to a college campus, for example, back
Charles
in the
Murray's
day?
theory that black people are
Charles Murray is a very interesting case because I agree. I think what is the line between free speech and hate speech? But Charles Murray has also written extensively about class and society and socioeconomic issues. And I guess one could argue, should he be allowed to talk about that one paragraph in the bell curve and be challenged and have a debate on campus about this. And I talked to a black PhD student at the University of Michigan. We feature him in the hour. And he said that the problem is Charles Murray's philosophy has been co-opted by white supremacists and used to spread racism all across the country. And that's why he didn't know platform Charles Murray when he went to Michigan, but he did challenge him on stage. So it's even Morty Shapiro believes that controversial figures should be allowed to speak and that there could be silent protests or a very spirited debate afterwards. But, I really don't come down on one side or the other. I basically show both positions and let viewers figure out where they stand on it.
One more from the series, very much on the lighter side from what we've been talking about so far, the episode Your Brain on Tech. And you say you actually went on a date with a female robot and a male robot. What does that even mean?
I didn't really go on a date. I mean, I think that basically I went to this sex robot factory. I think actually my guy is on the cover of New York Magazine, and he's obviously two-timing me because he went on a date with a New York Magazine writer. I was very upset when I heard that. No, but that whole hour is on. It asks the question, is technology robbing us of our essential humanity? In terms of our relationship with technology, our complete, obsession, which I have a real problem with this, with our smartphones, and whether or not it's going to affect every aspect of our lives, or how is it affecting every aspect of our lives. And I kind of go through the hour talking about how technology increasingly is taking over. I interviewed some people who had a chip put in their hands in Fall River, Wisconsin, this company where they can open doors and turn on lights and pay for things from the vending machine. And sort of this merging of man and machine was very interesting to me. And I talked to the guy who's head of the virtual reality lab at Stanford, where, increasingly, especially in Asia, men are having relationships like that movie Her with Joaquin Phoenix, where they have relationships with their devices. And so I thought, well, let's take it a step further. And there was this sex doll factory near San Diego where they all look like porn stars, which of course is something really weird and maybe should be considered when we think about this. And they're made of silicone, and they now are being equipped with AI. So you can talk to them and they can have conversations. And I'm sure "please take out the garbage" isn't part of their dialogue. But I interviewed a man who had 4 of these dolls and was waiting for the latest one, Harmony, because she is equipped with AI. It is super, super weird. What can I say? And you can have them tailor-made. They had all these different nipple sizes. Some look like Frisbees, some didn't, all different colors. You can do all the, the cosmetics of the doll. It was super weird. And they're $20,000 a piece, which is crazy to me. But do you have a clip from that?
I don't think we have a clip
from that. Okay, good.
People will just
Anyway, I sort of had fun with it, and I had a conversation with a couple of them. And it was just very bizarre with the dolls. Yeah, you can sit with them and talk to them. And Henry, the doll, commented, said something cheeky to me. And it was just really interesting. But, 1 in 4 men, I think, said they'd be willing to have sex with a robot in the next 50 years. So, as creepy as we think this is, it's not beyond the pale in terms of what technology may bring about in the years to come.
What percentage of women?
I don't think they were surveyed. But there are male robots, as we said, and my question was, and the genitals are detachable, and I asked if they were dishwasher safe. And we couldn't put that in because it's sort of a family show.
Yeah, people wash their dishes by hand these days.
Well, that's... I'm not touching that.
We're almost out of time. You became the first woman to anchor a major nightly newscast in 2006. Things have remained slow and gradual since then. Do you think the Me Too revelations of the last few months are changing that in a bigger way?
I do. I think this is truly a watershed moment. I think it will be interesting to see how companies respond and to see what policies are put in place, both written and sort of culturally. I think this is a long overdue course correction for how women are treated in the workplace. And I think what hasn't gotten that much attention is sort of the subtle sexism that I think women experience on a regular basis, kind of devalued, not sort of appreciated. There was an expression called heap-eating, which of course is when a woman has an idea and everyone's like, yeah. The man at the table comes out with the idea and everyone's like, that's brilliant. And, I think that I'm certainly more conscious about these sort of subtle signs of sexism. I'm on a number of boards, and I notice that when women speak up, they say, this may not be a good idea. I'm just throwing this out here, and I don't know if this even makes sense. And they apologize before. I never hear a man doing that. So I think some of it is also incumbent on women to also be more confident and strong in the workplace and have agency, as my daughters would say.
Do you think it might have meant anything to the 2016 campaign that so many men controlling the national campaign media narrative turned out to be harassing or otherwise behaving inappropriately toward women, while the potential first woman president was running? Charlie Rose, Mark Halperin, John Hockenberry, Ryan Lizza, Tavis Smiley, I could go on. They all lost their jobs, but later. Do you ever ask yourself if there's a relationship?
Oh, well, I think we all are products of our cultural conditioning. And I know when I was the anchor and managing editor of the CBS Evening News, I often called writers and producers out for framing things in a sexist way. And one of the most gratifying parts of that job for me was to be able to draw attention to stories that I think my male counterparts were not particularly interested in, like sexual assault in the military or dating violence and all kinds of stories like that. That's why diversity is so critically important in media and in all workplaces, because you bring such a diversity of ideas perspectives and points of view. So, yes, I do think it's significant because I think, again, it's that very subtle, insidious sexism that I think creeps into the coverage. And I think it's definitely noteworthy and something that needs to be remedied by having more women and more people of color in these powerful positions of authority in this country.
Katie Couric's current series on the National Geographic Channel, for which she is correspondent and executive producer, is America Inside Out. The final episode, The Age of Outrage, airs tomorrow. Thank you so much for coming to the Greene Space.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you.
Still to come, live from the Greene Space today, we will have Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign manager, Jeff Weaver, right after the news. And then later we will continue our series, The Eights, A Brief History of the Culture War, Decade by Decade, with historian Peniel Joseph and others on 1968. Right now it is time for the latest news. Here on the Greene Space stage, dressed for talking to the public. You should see how he usually comes in. Here is Richard Hake.
Hi, Brian. Turkey says it's prepared to take in wounded Palestinians after Israeli fire killed dozens and wounded hundreds during yesterday's Gaza border protests. The health minister said Turkey's emergency agency and the military are preparing an air bridge to transport the wounded. Meanwhile, despite the protests, New York Governor Cuomo says he's still planning to visit Israel later this week.
It's about showing up and showing up at a time of trouble and as a sign of solidarity.
But here in New York, many are calling out the actions of the Israeli military. Asaf Calderon is a member of the Jewish Voice for Peace.
It's really important to denounce these attacks, especially as Jews, because Israel is claiming to speak for all Jews.
The protests erupted as the U.S. Embassy moved to Jerusalem yesterday. The Israeli government said some Palestinians opened fire at troops and planted explosives. Several rallies are planned this week here in New York. President Trump says his wife Melania will be released in a few days from the hospital where she was treated for a kidney condition that the White House says is non-cancerous. Trump tweeted this morning, "Our great First Lady is doing really well. We'll be leaving hospital in 2 or 3 days." The New York State Legislature today is publicly interviewing the people who want to become the interim Attorney General following Eric Schneiderman's abrupt resignation last week. WNYC's Fred Mogul reports that a few prominent candidates have already dropped out of the running.
The Assembly Democrats previously announced that 16 people were interested in being interim AG. But with just hours to go before the public interviews got underway, 3 people withdrew their names. Hudson Valley Congressman Sean Maloney and former New York City Council member David Yaski now are both urging the legislature to pick the woman who's the acting AG, Barbara Underwood. She's been a top lawyer in the AG's office since 2007. Also pulling out is Jose Fernandez, an assistant secretary of state under President Obama.
4 states are holding primaries today. Pennsylvania voters are picking a candidate for Senate 3 months after a court fight ended with redrawn districts. In Idaho, voters are picking their Republican nominee for governor. There are also primaries in Nebraska and Oregon. The Supreme Court's decision clearing the way for gambling on sports events has prompted new warnings from those concerned about addiction. Keith White, president of the National Council on Problem Gambling, says unhealthy behaviors come anytime gambling rules are expanded and changed. As states implement sports betting, White says 1% of revenue should be earmarked for addiction services.
Prevention, education, treatment, research, and responsible gaming. So it's the gamut of services you see for things like alcohol and alcohol abuse.
White says operators of gaming facilities also need to have responsible gaming procedures in place. And a little bit of a roller coaster with the weather. Showers and thunderstorms are likely later this afternoon. It'll be warm today, highs near 85 degrees. Some of those storms could produce heavy rainfall and strong winds. More rain possible tonight into tomorrow, but then it's cooler tomorrow with a high only around 64 degrees. And getting the latest temperature reading right now from Central Park, 72 degrees. That's the latest from the WNYC Newsroom. I'm Richard Hake.
This year, you may not have to go to Las Vegas to bet big on the Super Bowl.
And for the Philadelphia Eagles, the long drought is over.
As the Supreme Court paves the way for legalized sports betting across the country, Nevada gets company. I'm Tanzina Vega, and that's next time on The Takeaway, weekday afternoons at 3 on 93.9 FM.
Support for WNYC comes from Valley Health System, serving northern New Jersey and southern New York with a distinctive patient experience. Learn more at mystory.valleyhealth.com. The New Jersey Symphony Orchestra. NJSO violinist Eric Wyrick leads the orchestra in Bach's Brandenburg Concertos, May 17th through 20th at NJPAC, Princeton, Red Bank, and New Brunswick, 1-800-ALLEGRO or njsymphony.org. Broadway Mall Association, presenting Kathy Ruttenberg on Broadway in Dreams Awake. 6 large-scale sculptures created by Ruttenberg now on display at Broadway between 64th and 157th Streets. More at broadwaymall.org. Your Part-Time Controller, helping nonprofit organizations with all of their accounting and financial reporting needs. Your Part-Time Controller, the nonprofit accounting specialists. More at yourparttimecontroller.com.
This is WNYC FM HD and AM New York, WNJT FM 88.1 Trenton, WNJP 88.5 Sussex, WNJY 89.3 Netcong, and WNJO 90.3 Toms River. We are New York and New Jersey Public Radio. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Live from the Greene Space today. And when we're in the Greene Space, you can watch the Brian Lehrer Show as well as listen, because we stream live video when we're in the Greene Space. It's equipped for that. So if you want to tune us in, video as well as audio-wise, you can go to our Facebook page. That's one place where we stream it. That's the WNYC Facebook page. Or you can go to WNYC.org, the station's website, or you can even go to the Greene Space's own website, the Greene Space, and Greene has an E at the end of it, thegreenspace.org. Any of those three places if you want to stream live video of our show for the next hour or so. I want to mention one thing before we get to our next guest. I got a note about 2 of the audience members in the Greene Space today from someone we know. This says, 2 of my friends, and possibly some of the biggest fans of the show out there, got married this weekend. I found out yesterday morning that they'll be seeing the show in the Greene Space as their honeymoon. And this says, I'd love to be able to do something special for them, even if it's just giving them a shout out. So Matt and Allison, are you actually here? Are Matt and Allison here? Hey, congratulations. What, you can't afford a real honeymoon? You know, you could go, I mean, it's not the most romantic thing in the world, right? You could go
one thing at a time.
You could go to the Caribbean, or after that newscast, you could go to Atlantic City. You can sports gamble now.
We like to start slow.
I don't know if the show's going to get you in the mood, so. Congratulations, and thank you so much for coming to our show. We're absolutely thrilled that you wanted to be here at this special moment. With me now in the Greene Space, Jeff Weaver, Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign manager and still senior political advisor. Weaver's new book describes their work together since Sanders was mayor of Burlington, Vermont, runs through the presidential campaign, and looks ahead to the future of the Democratic Party and progressive politics generally. The book is called How Bernie Won. Jeff Weaver, welcome to WNYC.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. Thank you.
You do know that Bernie lost, right?
Okay, well, you know, it depends what the measure of winning or losing is. If you're talking about winning the nomination, yes, in fact, we did come up short of the nomination. However, if you look at the campaign, which started at 3% in the polls and ultimately resulted in him winning 23 contests and 43% of the Democratic primary vote, you know, the issues that he was talking about at the beginning of the campaign, $15 minimum wage, Medicare for all, free tuition at public colleges and universities, you know, significant criminal justice reform. You know, these are issues now that are in the mainstream of Democratic Party politics. And if you look at a number of the leading candidates for president, or talked about candidates for president in 2020, they have all moved to adopt those positions. Most of them are enshrined in the Democratic Party platform. And so, you know, I think, in fact, that Bernie Sanders has done an amazing job at moving the conversation away from the right-wing shift that we have had in this country to open up a whole new way of looking at problems and how we solve them.
I think we have at least one good example of that here in New York. Governor Cuomo pushed through a free public college program in New York State. It's not exactly the Bernie model, but it's free public college tuition, or the last pieces of that tuition, for people who demonstrate that they can't afford it another way, for many CUNY and SUNY students. And I think to credit Bernie Sanders is fair.
And Governor Cuomo had Bernie Sanders at the announcement of that program, as a matter of fact.
I forgot that.
And let's I'll give credit all the way around where it's due. In the book we talk about how, as the primary campaign came to a close, there was a meeting with Bernie and Secretary Clinton in a Hilton hotel in Washington, D.C., where they talked about coming together around some progressive issues. And one of the issues where they came around together was on this issue of free tuition at public colleges and universities. And so, there were some changes from what he was originally proposing, but essentially they merged their two college proposals and brought the best of both together. So.
And listeners, if you want to call in and talk to Bernie Sanders' campaign manager from 2016, Jeff Weaver, or folks here in the Greene Space, if you want to raise your hand, we'll come around with a microphone on the phones. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. I know everybody wants to know if he's going to run for president in 2020, but let's stay on 2018 for a second.
Sure, of course.
There was a primary election last week in which there was a Bernie Sanders-backed candidate versus an Elizabeth Warren-backed candidate. Is the party or the progressive movement that fractured?
Maybe it's that dominant that we actually have a primary contest between the people in the progressive wing. That may be the answer to that.
Is that going to be something do you think that situation was unique, or are we going to be seeing more of that as especially primary season goes on?
Right. Well, Bernie actually didn't endorse in that race. Our Revolution, which was the organization that spun out of his presidential campaign, did endorse Dennis Kucinich. Look, there are a lot of people running all across the country. There are a number of races, certainly for Congress, where you have a number of progressives running against each other. And, my feeling now is my feeling in 2016, which is let the voters decide who the nominees are. That's really what we should do.
Has Bernie been going around the country a lot?
Yes, he has been. So he has been doing really three things since the disappointing election of Donald Trump. One is he has tried to keep the grassroots energized and hopeful. He did a series of rallies around the country when the president was trying to dismantle the Affordable Care Act. He did a number of rallies around the country against the disastrous Republican tax bill. So that was one element of it. He has been raising money for down-ballot Democrats. In fact, over the last 2 years, he's raised, I think, over $6 million for down-ballot Democrats across the country. And number three is he's actually been out campaigning for Democrats around the country. He was just in Pennsylvania. John Fetterman's running for lieutenant governor there. Rich Laser is in one of the congressional districts. Greg Edwards, another one. Jess King, another one. So he was just in Pennsylvania. He's been in the upper Midwest. He's been in the Southwest. He was down in the South. So he has been actively campaigning for candidates across the country.
You believe, obviously, that Bernie Sanders or someone like him is more positioned to bring back Trump voters than a more centrist Democrat. And again, we'll get to 2020. But here in 2018, the issue is control of Congress.
Sure.
And David Leonhardt has a New York Times column today that says, I'm paraphrasing, but it's really district by district, and the progressive purists should realize that. Fair enough?
No, look, I do think it's district by district, and I think what's of concern to there are obviously overarching themes that affect everyone: jobs, healthcare, education, issues of equality. But there are local issues that affect different communities differently, and I think that there has to be some room for candidates to do that. But at the end of the day, the question is who does that candidate stand with? Is it working people, middle-income people they're going to stand with, or are they going to stand with corporate interests? So, the modern history of the Democratic Party really took off with FDR, and he clearly was on the side of working people and middle-income people. It was, when we think about the debates we have now and lack of civility, if you look back at some of the things that were lodged against FDR, it's incredible. And the Democratic Party got off track in the 90s. With this neoliberal experiment. And, 2016 in its historical context was really the grassroots of the party trying to retake the party and put it back on its historical trajectory.
And so for president, if Sanders versus Clinton, was what you just described, the progressive wing versus the more centrist or neoliberal wing. Is that even relevant for 2020? Are there any centrist neoliberal Democrats left who will be running for president?
Well, I mean, as I say in the book, I think that the grassroots has repudiated the neoliberals, but they still hold sway within certain organs of the party. Certainly among the party donor class, they have representation. There are certainly corporate interests that have circled around the party for the last 20 years who certainly would like to reassert themselves. It's just not a strategy for winning. Right?
We have at least 5 people in our tri-state area being mentioned as possible presidential hopefuls. Obviously, you have your loyalty to Bernie, but how would you handicap any of these people? From New York, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, Governor Andrew Cuomo, Mayor Bill de Blasio. From New Jersey, Senator Cory Booker, and from Connecticut, Senator Chris Murphy, potentially. Who would you be most afraid of on behalf of Bernie Sanders?
Now, this is a very provocative. This is a very provocative question. Look, one of the things that's always amazing to me is if you look at the people who are being talked about as presidential contenders on the Democratic side for 2020, the incredible pool of talent that you have there, as opposed to what we saw in 2016 on the Republican side, when it's been variously described as a clown car or what have you, but it was, there was just a real sort of dearth of talent and insight. So I think the Democratic Party is in a great place for 2020, frankly. I just think there's a lot of great candidates out there.
Can you make the case today that Sanders is a better candidate for the general election than Senator Gillibrand?
Yeah, look, what we found across the country in 2016 is that Bernie Sanders was able to bring together what are the groups who have maintained support for the Democratic Party, but he was also able to reach out to voters who were previously part of what I call the FDR coalition, who have since left as a result of what happened in the 1990s. And you'd see that he actually did better with rural Democrats, with more conservative, quote unquote, more conservative Democrats among rank and file voters. So I think he has the opportunity to put together a coalition that nobody else who could run could put together.
Is Bernie Sanders a Democrat? Are you? And does it matter?
I am a Democrat. Bernie Sanders is a member of the Democratic leadership. I'm going to give you the circuitous answer. Member of the Democratic leadership in the Senate. He has raised millions of dollars for down ballot Democrats. He was a superdelegate to the Democratic National Convention. He was a strong, obviously, advocate for Hillary Clinton's election in the general election in 2016. If you go to the Vermont Democratic Party website of their elected officials, you'll see him there. He is the Democratic Party endorsed candidate in Vermont. So we don't have party registration in Vermont. Nobody carries a little card in their wallet that says D or R, and that's true in many, many states. And so, what does it mean to be a Democrat? I think he is a leader in the Democratic Party.
It's one of the issues that's relevant to how the primaries are run in a lot of states where people could not vote for Bernie Sanders in the primary because he was an independent. You obviously want to see that change, but the argument on the other side is, well, wait, it's a party with members, and so they should have their primary, and that's the way things should work.
Right, but look, if say you live in New York, right, and you donate to the Democratic Party, you work on behalf of Democratic candidates in the general election, you're a reliable Democratic voter. If you have the little card, you get to vote in the primary. If you don't have the little card, you don't get to vote in the primary. If you go to Vermont or Virginia or a lot of other places, if you're a similarly situated person, you don't have the little card because they don't have little cards, you get to vote in the primary. And so voters in different places are treated very differently. And one of the problems that we're having is that young people overwhelmingly now are registering as independents or no party affiliation, and you're shutting out a whole new generation of voters whose relationship to institutions, not just political parties, but to religion and companies and everything else, is very different than the way we think about our relationships to those institutions. And if you want to have a party that's going to be increasingly older and smaller, I think the closed primaries is the way to go.
My guest is Jeff Weaver, who was the 2016 campaign manager for Bernie Sanders. He has a new book called How Bernie Won: Inside the Revolution that's taking back our country and where we go from here. And let's take a question from here in the Greene Space. Ma'am, hi.
Hello, I'm Jackie Hawken from Bristol in the UK, and one of the other things he's been doing is travelling abroad, because he came to Bristol, to my city, and was received with tumultuous applause, actually. We really love him. What's interesting is that Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn are both white, socialist-leaning older men who appeal very much to the younger voters. Why do you think that is?
Look, in our increasingly virtual world, I think people are looking for authenticity in their political leaders. And I think both Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn are viewed as people who at least tell it the way they see it, right? And I think voters respond to that, certainly here in the U.S. I mean, people remember George W. Bush. When you'd poll the issues, the positions he took and stood for, people disagreed with him, right, across the board. But when you said, who are you going to vote for president? I'm going to vote for George W. Bush because, he's a straight shooter and he tells it the way it is, and I don't agree. And I think people really appreciate the fact that you have people who are sort of unabashed in their pronouncements.
We have another question in the Greene Space over here. Hi.
Yes, in reference to Bernie running for president, he's running. There are a couple of issues.
Wait, who's the campaign manager here?
I don't know. I'm happy to go back to my comic book store, frankly.
Okay, your cover story. Two things that Cory Booker and I think some others is this idea of every job for everybody. Everybody has a job, which pays the minimum wage, blah, blah, blah. And then there's the other issue, which I don't hear discussed, and that's the guaranteed minimum income, because robots are going to be taking over. If you can get a $20,000 robot doll, then you can get a doll that'll prepare hamburgers and put people out of work. And that doll for $20,000 is going to replace 5 people. Anyway, could you compare those two, the guaranteed annual income, I'm sure you're familiar with that, yep, and the other job for everybody? Because the job for everybody doesn't seem so good to me.
First of all, you should be in broadcasting because that was a great segue from our last segment
right,
with the robot doll.
Tying it all together.
And Jeff, we've had 3 authors in recent times, Chris Hughes, and who was a Facebook founder, and Andy Stern, who, as you know, is the head of SEIU for a long time, and there was a third one, all calling for a guaranteed national income for exactly the reason the gentleman says. Automation, and they had their different reasons, but primarily automation is going to replace so many jobs. Is that a position that Bernie Sanders is willing to adopt, and do you think that position has any future in mainstream politics?
So I'll answer the second part first. I certainly think that that's an issue that we're going to have to confront, right? It is always the case that sort of, the people who have the money, who are going to set up the factories and so on and so forth, are always looking for the cheapest way to make anything. Starting in the 90s, they started shipping jobs overseas because they could get cheaper labor there. If they think it's going to be cheaper to use automation, they're going to be doing, they'll do that too. But that's the responsibility of policymakers to make sure that doesn't, destroy the economic lives of working men and women in this country, which is something that we have not been willing to confront. Bernie Sanders is actually working on a bill that was reported in the news, working on a bill about guaranteed employment for people who want it at a $15 minimum wage. These are not, I wouldn't call them competing, but they're different ways of getting at the same problem, which is how do you make sure that the economy works for everybody in this country?
You're not there yet, and you're hoping you don't have to get there.
No, look, these are issues we're going to have to confront as a society. How do we share the resources that, frankly, are generated by a company, but the company benefits from the fact that their trucks are using the road, and that the military is protecting their installations, and the police disproportionately protect them, and just because they have so much more than everybody else does. And I think we have to understand the social context in which profits are made and how those profits are distributed.
Let's take another question from here in the Greene Space. Hi there.
Hi. Bernie, at an appearance with Elizabeth Warren, made a statement that Trump voters are not racist, they're not sexist, they're not generally bigots. Sitting at the butt end of their hatred, they actually are. And I found those statements incredibly offensive from Bernie. Has he reconsidered those thoughts at all?
Well, I think, I was very interested after the election. Van Jones, who was a very thoughtful CNN person, has some thoughts about on this front. And, Is there racism in this country? Absolutely. Is it systematized in many ways? Absolutely. Is it personal to many people? Absolutely. Does it need to be ferreted out in every place it exists? Absolutely. But what you have to reconcile and wrestle with is when you look at people who voted for President Obama twice and then voted for Trump, you have to reconcile whether those people's primary political motivation is racial animus.
Not a lot of people in that category, right?
No, there are a lot of people in that category. There's one county, one media market in Pennsylvania, Scranton Media Market. It's 10% of the state. And it represents it's a quote-unquote white working class part of Pennsylvania. That 10% represents 40% of the switch from Obama to Trump. So how do you reconcile that those people are primarily motivated by racial animus?
Right.
I'm not saying there aren't people who vote for Trump who are motivated by racial animus, because there certainly are.
But it's pockets. And let me follow up on the gentleman's question like this. Trump is, I've said this before, I'm just going to say it, a practicing racist.
Absolutely.
In the respect that he consciously uses racist appeals and nativist appeals to energize his base. That means that there is a large enough core of people out there for whom it resonates when he does those things, that it should be very troubling to other Americans and be denounced by someone like Bernie Sanders.
Who denounces it constantly about Trump's nativism,
in the population,
his xenophobia,
as well as by Trump.
Oh no, absolutely. Look, there's no room for that in America. There just is no room for that, and he has been very vocal about that. He was in the South recently, meeting with a new generation of black leaders, and there really is. It can't be strong enough, the denunciation of it.
Is it strong enough by him?
It can never be strong enough. That's the problem, right? I mean, you've just seen it. We have Louisiana. We have a young black man they've ruled it a homicide. His killing at the hands of police. I mean, this just continues and continues and continues. And so when you say, is it strong enough? It can never be strong enough.
But just to finish the thread on the listener, the audience member's question, if Bernie Sanders said that, well, those voters, Trump's voters aren't racist, is that too simplistic?
Yeah, it is
too generous. To too many people.
Are there people who voted for Trump who are racist and who have racial animus? Yes. Did everybody who voted for Trump a racist or primarily motivated by racial animus? I think the answer to that is obviously no.
Let's take a phone call on line 2. Keith in Edison, you're on WNYC with Jeff Weaver, Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign manager. Hi, Keith. Do we have Keith on line 2? Can we give that a shot?
Yes, hello? Can you
Hi,
hear me?
now you're on. Hi there.
Hi. Thank you for having me. I did have a question. It's kind of a controversial one, but I just wanted to get a bit more understanding about how Bernie Sanders, you said earlier that the primary was won by Hillary Clinton, but then facts kind of pop up later on showing how Hillary kind of rigged that DNC to basically take the rug out from underneath him. And I'm wondering as to why that isn't really spoken about as much.
And in the book, you don't hold back in your criticism of the DNC's favoritism toward Hillary. What do you want to say about it now?
I mean, no, I don't hold back about it. Other people have written about it as well. Donna Brazil, who's a former DNC chair, wrote about it. Others have written about it. Look, the system was... Hillary Clinton was running basically unopposed. The party came in behind her. Bernie announced at the end of April in 2015, he was at 3% in the polls. But as he gained steam over the summer, what is called the media dubbed the summer of Sanders, the Democratic Party circled around Secretary Clinton. And whether it's the debate schedule, the joint fundraising agreements, the way the caucuses were held in some places, there were a lot of things done that I think an honest person standing back and looking at it objectively would say, that's not really even-handed. And, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who was the chair at the time, was certainly orchestrating much of this.
You learned some of these damning things about the DNC from the emails that were presumably stolen by Russia.
Right.
did it ever occur to you to refuse to use them against the Democratic Party because they were the product of Russian hacking, maybe even in collusion with the Trump campaign?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say that I'm using them against the Democratic Party. So, there were many people on the executive committee of the Democratic National Party who were at various times trying to keep Debbie Wasserman Schultz from putting her finger on the scale. So it is not the Democratic Party writ large, first of all. And two, look, what came out in those emails, they were clearly ill-gotten gains. But there are things in there which have not been refuted and which, based on what I know, are not refutable. And people need to know what happened if that information is available.
So you're less critical of Russian meddling than some other Democrats might be? Because they reveal true things?
Nice segue. No, I am not less I am not less critical of Russian meddling. Absolutely not. Look, and I'll say this about Hillary Clinton. No candidate should have to run against the Foreign Intelligence Service of another country. Hillary Clinton should not have had to run against the Russian intelligence service, which she clearly had to do. That being said, I also think in foreign countries they should not have to run against our intelligence service, frankly.
Last question then. Just give people from your vantage point of, knowing so much about how politics works, a viewer's guide, a campaign manager's eye guide to the 2018 election year. What are the big things that you think people should be looking at, either in what's left of the primary season or as we head toward the general?
Right. Well, you've seen some polls that have shown the sort of margin between Democrats and Republicans closing just a bit, and I think you'll see those go up and down as we get closer and closer. But what I have seen out there, and this has been in all the races since Trump was elected, whether it has been a Democratic victory or a Republican victory, is that the Republican has grossly underperformed where Trump was. I mean, in Montana, the Democratic candidate for Congress there, even though he lost, did 20% better than Hillary Clinton had done in Montana, right? So the margin is closing everywhere. The level of excitement and enthusiasm among Democratic voters is super high. And so, it's going to be, the burden is going to be on us in the Democratic Party to keep that enthusiasm up, to present candidates who have bold visions, who are able to excite voters, and these are, the voters who vote less consistently. These are the people who typically don't come out in midterms and allow Republicans to win. We've got to make sure those voters come out.
Based on giving people an alternative vision of policy, not just running against Trump and his character?
Look, absolutely. If anybody's not convinced about Trump's character by now, you're not going to convince them. And I think, look, the Clinton campaign has been criticized to some degree that they over-focused on Trump's personal flaws or financial misdeeds, and not enough on an alternative policy vision. I mean, if you look, and you can go online and look at this, both campaigns had a 2-minute ad at the end of the campaign, which ran in battleground states. Trump's ad is focused almost exclusively on jobs, the economy, trade, helping people out. Hillary's was a much more sort of personal ad about her personal values. And I just think as a political professional, whatever that means, that his ad was a much more effective communication to the voters.
The book is called How Bernie Won. The author is Jeff Weaver, the 2016 campaign manager and still senior advisor to Bernie Sanders. Please thank Jeff Weaver, for coming to the Greene Space. And coming up next, we continue our series, The Eights, a brief history of the American culture wars decade by decade. We are in 1968, right after this.
Do you believe everything you see on social media? Stick with the names you trust.
This is Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Rachel Martin in Washington, D.C.
And I'm David Greene.
Nancy Solomon, WNYC News.
Arun Venugopal, WNYC News.
Andrea Bernstein, WNYC News.
Carrie Johnson, NPR News, Washington.
Ilya Meritz, WNYC News.
Cindy Rodriguez, WNYC News.
Listen to Morning Edition every day on WNYC.
WNYC is supported by Hospital for Special Surgery, specializing in orthopedics and rheumatology. Appointments and info at hss.edu. How you move is why we're here. WNYC is a media partner of Vulture Festival with conversations, panels, screenings, performances, and live podcasts featuring Tracy Morgan, Samantha Bee, Claire Danes, and more. May 19th and 20th at Milk Studios. Details at vulturefestival.com.
Remember what it was like to be in the 4th grade?
It was a great day.
A lot of hopes.
Kelsey, think. I'm thinking.
And challenges. Especially for kids growing up in poor neighborhoods.
Really, this class should be 2 classes. I need to make this work the best way possible.
On the next reveal, can schools help kids reach the American dream? Tonight at 8 on 93.9 FM, WNYC.
Now we demands a chance to do things for ourselves. We're tired of beating our head against the wall and working for someone else. Say it loud. Say it loud. Say it loud.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, and with some appropriate music from 1968. Now we continue our series, The Eights, a brief history of the culture wars decade by decade. We will stay in 1968 today as we continue to ask how the heck the United States elected Richard Nixon, of all people, at the end of the 1960s. Today we'll focus on the backlash to the civil rights laws and growing Black Power movement. 68, of course, was the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated. He had continued to preach love and integration, but as we have discussed on this program a few times this year, he had also become increasingly radicalized and despairing over the persistence of poverty and the Vietnam War. But King was killed in April, and other voices were coming to the fore in the movement for racial equality. One of them was the writer James Baldwin, who appeared on TV in 1968 on The Dick Cavett Show.
I don't know what most white people in this country feel, but I can only include what they feel from the state of their institutions. I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that we have a Christian church which is white and a Christian church which is black. I know, as Malcolm X once put it, that the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday. That says a great deal for me about a Christian nation. It means that I can't afford to trust most white Christians and certainly cannot trust the Christian church. I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me. That doesn't matter, but I know I'm not in their unions. I don't know if the real estate lobby has anything against black people, but I know the real estate lobbies keep me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks they give my children to read and the schools that we have to go to. Now, this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my wife, my woman, my sister, my children, on some idealism which you assure me exists in America, which I have never seen.
So for those of you who never heard his voice before, there was James Baldwin on the Dick Cavett Show in 1968. The Black Panther Party and the phrase Black Power had come into being in 1966. Black Power was coined by Stokely Carmichael, if I have my history right. Black Panther chairman and co-founder Bobby Seale was one of the protest leaders at the 1968 Democratic Convention.
Whenever the people disagree with the political decisions that's been made upon their heads, that whenever the people disagree with those political decisions, the racist power structure sends in guns and force to see that the people accept those political decisions. But we are here as revolutionaries to let them know that we refuse to accept those political decisions that maintain the oppression of our black people and other people in the world.
Bobby Seale, outside the Democratic Convention in Chicago. At the Republican Convention in Miami, Nixon sought to cultivate the white resentment to clips like we just heard in his acceptance speech.
Let those who have the responsibility to enforce our laws and our judges who have the responsibility to interpret them be dedicated to the great principles of civil rights, but let them also recognize that the first civil right of every American is to be free from domestic violence, and that right must be guaranteed in this country.
Nixon from his Republican Convention acceptance speech in August 1968. With me now, Peniel Joseph, University of Texas History and Public Affairs professor and author of books including Waiting Till the Midnight Hour, A Narrative History of Black Power in America, and Dark Days, Bright Nights, From Black Power to Barack Obama. Professor Joseph, always great to have you on. Welcome back to WNYC.
Hey, good to be on with you, Brian.
and we don't often get applause for a telephone guest, but in the Greene Space, sorry audience, this is what you get, because we really wanted Peniel Joseph on this show, and he lives in Austin, Texas. So can you reflect back to 1968 and how the Martin Luther King movement and the Black Panther or larger Black Power movement either complemented each other or had different goals and worldviews?
Well, I think when we think about Black Power in 1968 and King's movement, when we think about the civil rights movement, they're going to both intersect and diverge with each other. The interesting thing about the Black Power movement is that just like Black Lives Matter in our contemporary context, it's talking about structural and systemic oppression, at times in ways that are much more acute and globally focused than the civil rights movement, even though there were civil rights activists, including King, who talked about global systems of oppression. But it's really the Black Power movement that talks about white supremacy as a systemic global superstructure. It talks about capitalism and economic exploitation and racial capitalism. It talks about institutional racism. So Black Power no longer just simply personalizes racism or racial prejudice or racial bias and says these are systemic problems with American democracy and liberal democratic capitalism. And what's interesting about Dr. King is that Dr. King always maintains his commitment to nonviolence and civil disobedience, but he really starts to accept and embrace the Black Power movement's systemic critique of white racism. And certainly that clip that you just played, Brian, James Baldwin becomes the key Black intellectual of the period, who is talking and friends with both Black Power activists and civil rights activists. So he's really an extraordinary figure.
Listeners, we invite you to continue with the oral history portion of our series, The Eights, a brief history of the American culture wars, decade by decade. In particular for today, first priority will go to any African-American listeners who remember how your racial consciousness was evolving in 1968. Do we have anybody who fits into that category? 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692, as we continue to invite different groups of people of different ages with different kinds of memories as we progress through the decades with this series. Were you yourself going from a Martin Luther King mindset to a Black Panther or Black Power mindset, or anything else you want to say about your own politics and political self-awareness in 1968 and how you saw white backlash at that time too? 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. As, by the way, Dr. Joseph is in a environment with some background music in Austin, Texas. In case you're all wondering where that is, we will live with it. It's not intrusive. It's kind of pleasing. But again, in particular for today, first priority for our oral histories will go to any African-American listeners who remember how your racial consciousness was evolving in 1968. Were you yourself going from a Martin Luther King mindset to a Black Panther or a Black Power mindset, or anything else you want to say about your own politics and self-awareness in 68 and how you saw white backlash at that time too, and what did you think when Nixon was elected president? 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Professor Joseph, oh, you turned it off. That's good. Or I know you're not home, so you don't have control over that. So why so soon after the major civil rights laws were passed did increasing radicalization take place?
Well, I'd say that the radicalization had been going on all throughout what I call the heroic period of the civil rights movement, which would be May 17th, 1954, and the Brown desegregation Supreme Court decision, all the way to August 6, 1965, and the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So when we look at day to day in every single city in America, there was an increase in protest against racial segregation, against public school segregation, against unions that were disallowing Black people into their unions. So they were building trades protests. So when we look at 1963, for instance, when John F. Kennedy does his major public address to the United States that evening of June 11th, 1963, President Kennedy, before the March on Washington, says that there's a revolution happening in the United States, and it can be a violent or a peaceful revolution. And it's in that speech where he says that, racial equality is part of the American dream. It must be part of American democracy. But he's saying that, Brian, because the summer of 1963, 15,000 people are arrested in civil rights protests all throughout the United States. It's not just Birmingham and Mississippi, it's Philadelphia, it's Oakland, it's New York City. So when we think about what's going on before the passage of the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act, and before the passage of the Open Housing Act, Fair Housing Act in 68, there's all this social protest and this disruption and this civil disobedience and this organizing for really, we have to think about the civil rights movement as a movement for citizenship. And it's a movement for full and equal citizenship, not just to take away the different institutional forces and state-sanctioned violence that was marginalizing Black citizenship, but to give Black people access to full and unfettered citizenship. By 65, Dr. King, after visiting Watts and cutting short his vacation in Los Angeles, has blown up. He says that citizenship means a living wage, full-time employment, good schools, health care, and good food, and good and safe and secure integrated neighborhoods. So by 1968, Black Power activists are really talking about citizenship, but they're saying that they're making the claim that citizenship is connected to systems of political domination within the United States, but also globally as well.
There was some violence in the protests in 67 in some cities and some in 68 after King was killed, and street crime was rising in those days. How much do you see Nixon as having run on racial backlash in those respects, and how do you see the Democrats as having maybe failed to address it or to compensate politically in some way that contributed to the election of Nixon?
Well, yeah, I think that he absolutely runs on, people call this backlash politics, Brian, but I would really say he's running on an acute and very perceptive understanding of the politics and practices of white supremacy, which always stay consistent and constant in the United States. He's able, much more than George Wallace and much better than Strom Thurmond, who had run in 1948 and 1968 respectively as segregationists, as white supremacists, Nixon is able to congeal that group with a cohesive message of really white nationalism and a cohesive message of law and order, and using racially coded words that people understand are anti-Black. When we think about the Democratic Party, and that's a great question, Brian, in June of 1968, President Johnson signs the Safe Streets Act, and that is an omnibus crime bill in 1968 that provides the context for mass incarceration, and it provides the context for the proliferation of prisons and a prison industrial complex in the United States. And that's really a bipartisan bill, and a Democratic president leads that. So what we see is that at a time in 1968, when the Kerner Commission says that what the country needs is more schools, more jobs, better health care, more social workers, more rehabilitation, more playgrounds, more safety, we get more cops and more brutalization and more violence in Black communities and against Black communities. And that's a bipartisan policy response to not just Black Power, but also Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of a beloved community, and a community where poverty and anti-poverty supersedes geopolitical strategies in Vietnam and Southeast Asia and the Cold War. So we get, the communities all across the United States, they ask and plead and demand butter, but they get guns pointed against them.
Let's take a phone call. Here is some oral history from Jan in Brooklyn, who has some memories of 1968. Jan, thank you so much for calling in. You're on WNYC. Can we put up line 2 there? Jan in Brooklyn. Jan, hi there. Now we've got you.
Hello.
Hi there.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Thank you so much for calling.
And thank you so much for having this conversation. I was a junior high school student growing up in Texas at the time that Dr. King was killed. And my family were professionals, and we basically supported Dr. King. But when my brother called to tell us that Dr. King had been killed, and he was a very gentle person, and he was so angry and just made the whole picture of nonviolence. It totally changed for me. Certainly, I guess in the 21st century words, maybe I became radicalized. But, starting wearing my hair natural and making sure that I addressed every instance of disrespect and discrimination that I found in my very segregated community. Whether it was the smallest thing of making sure that our voices were heard in the school newspaper, or making sure that people had the right to speak out at any kind of gathering. I think that perhaps it was Dr. King's assassination that opened my eyes to the systemic type of racism that certainly I saw every day, and I saw growing up in the segregated schools, in transportation, in accommodations. Whenever we traveled, especially until we got above past Texas, we certainly had to go on a network of either the fraternities or the sororities or the churches to make sure that we had decent places to stay, decent, safe places to stay. So I was faced with the discrimination every day that you could see as far as living and working was concerned, certainly in Texas at that time.
How much better or not has it gotten, in your opinion, from then to now?
Better? I think that there has been a...
Better or not was my question.
Well, I don't know that we can say totally better. I think there is a face that is different. Certainly, we see more African Americans in places of power. Certainly, at that time, more and more people were running for elective office, and we are standing on the basis of those who were doing that political work at that time. We've had mayors, we've had governors, we've had a black president. The thing is, though, that this conversation is still continuing. A lot of minds and hearts have not been changed. A lot of minds and hearts continue to dwell in a vision of a past America that was better when people had fewer opportunities or options to be able to speak out and to be able to express themselves and to be able to stand and be their total selves without facing discrimination.
Jan, thank you so much for sharing your memories. And I've got to run, but thank you so much for recalling 1968.
Thank you for listening and for having this conversation.
And please call us again. All right, we're going to take a break, and then we have some more historical clips from 1968, and then we have two special guests with their memories of a particular series of events in 1968 that we will reveal when we come back with them. Brian Lehrer, live from the Greene Space on WNYC in our series, The Eights.
On the next Fresh Air, we talk with Michael Pollan. He's best known for his books about food, but his new book is about the history of psychedelic drugs and current experiments with psychedelics in therapeutic settings to treat depression, fear of death, and addiction. The book also recounts Pollan's own recent personal experiments with LSD and psilocybin. Join us. Weekdays at 2 on 93.9 FM WNYC.
WNYC supporters include the New York Botanical Garden, beginning May 19th, Georgia O'Keeffe, Visions of Hawaii, featuring the artist's little-known depictions of the Hawaiian Islands and the plants and landscapes that inspired them. More at nybg.org. Mohonk Mountain House, located in the Hudson Valley. Family-owned since 1869, the resort offers farm-to-table dining, a full spa, and 85 miles of hiking trails. Mohonk.com. John Theurer Cancer Center at Hackensack University Medical Center, part of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Hackensack Meridian Health Partnership. John Theurer Cancer Center is pioneering the possible. More at jtcancercenter.org.
If you believe democracy requires a free press, your station is WNYC, 93.9 FM and AM 820, NPR News and the New York Conversation.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. In our series, The Eights, a brief history of the culture wars, decade by decade. We're in 1968, and let me play another clip. The student protests were taking place at that time around the country, and certainly here in New York, very famously at Columbia University. And there were really two sets of protests. One was the mostly white student body over the university's relationship with the military during the Vietnam War. The other was by ethnically diverse students and residents of the neighborhood, mostly black, over the location and proposed rules for a new gym that the school was planning to build in Morningside Park. It got the nickname Jim, GYM, Crow. Here is one anti-gym protester as heard in the documentary Columbia Revolt by Third World Newsreel.
But I don't think a gym 9 stories high with facilities for black people in the basement with a back door is something that black people want. I don't trust anybody in the administrative network of Columbia University because they have lied, they have contradicted themselves. Grayson Kirk wrote us a letter saying, we have stopped the gym. And the next damn day, the Board of Trustees states, we have stopped the gym temporarily.
So that clip from 1968. I'm going to pass along a little 1968 relevant news that just came over, and we report the death of author Tom Wolfe, whose, among other things, book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, was published in 1968. So Tom Wolfe, and I don't have his age here, but he was quite elderly, and we have just learned, he was just a guest on the show last year, but Tom Wolfe has passed away. With us, 2 students from Columbia in 1968. Raymond Brown is here in the Greene Space. He grew up to be a prominent attorney who, for example, recently represented Senator Menendez in his corruption trial that ended in a mistrial, and the senator will not be retried. Mr. Brown is a partner at the Greenbaum, Rowe, Smith, and Davis law firm and was a student leader of the Student Afro-American Society at Columbia in '68. And on the phone, Nancy Bieberman, who grew up to be co-founder of the South Bronx Community Group, the Women's Housing and Economic Development Corporation. Raymond and Nancy, thank you for giving us a few minutes. Raymond, where were you in 1968?
1968, I was at the relevant part in Hamilton Hall at Columbia University, part of a distinctly black group of students who held that building as part of a larger demonstration.
And you've written that the New York Times and other media of the day never understood that the black students' occupation of Hamilton Hall was not an ancillary coda to a new left uprising, but the pivotal act of the whole Columbia uprising. Can you explain that and how it was seen by different people at the time?
I think it was deliberately not seen by many. I think the Times inadvertently and deliberately didn't want to deal with the structural question of black students saying, we value our connection to this community. We don't want you to use your institutional power to take land and resources for yourself. And oh, by the way, we don't like this racist war you're involved in. And that we were pivotally important because on the heels of the uprising in Harlem after Dr. King's death, great sensitivity about moving against us. So our role was pivotal. What's arisen since then has been, I talk to Mark Rudd all the time, and people always ask me, do you know Mark Rudd? And Mark has come up with an answer in which he says, well, do you know the black students of Hamilton Hall? Because we were pivotal, but Chairman Mao, for example, sent us a telegram. He could find out that we were there, but the New York Times couldn't.
Mark Rudd was the white student leader who became iconic as a student leader in 1968. Nancy, you wrote a Times op-ed last year called My Vietnam War, partly about you and the Columbia protest. How did you see the two strands of it then that Raymond was just talking about, and how do you today?
Well, at the time, I was important to note that I was 19 years old, which is to say young. And I arrived at Columbia, nurtured by a family that was liberal. I was always engaged in age-appropriate civil rights activities when I was in high school even. Worked the summer of '64 for the Philadelphia NAACP, where I grew up. And I came to Columbia in 1966 to a campus that was already, activist in the sense that the Vietnam War was a major part of the consciousness of students. Young men were being drafted to go fight in the war, and we were already seeing horrific scenes of slaughter of innocent people on television. Vietnam was famously the first televised war, and that is how people my age started to understand what was going on in the war and why this war might be different from the war my father fought in World War II.
Let me jump back over to Raymond and ask, your reminiscence that you've written includes how you got support from black leaders of the day like Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown. Where did the gymnasium issue fit into the kinds of things we've been hearing from Peniel Joseph in this segment, and maybe even any larger notions of culture war that tie then to now?
Well, first of all, we, for several years, had a group that tried to organize on the basis of race, a great challenge because we were diverse in our backgrounds. James Baldwin was the first person who came to campus. Interestingly enough, you played a clip from James Baldwin earlier. And interestingly enough, he didn't want to talk about himself or his writings, but about who he thought we were and whether our continued identification with the community would override any notions of self-advancement, the upward mobility that's promised in the American dream. At the end, after the demonstration, the first thing we did was to hold a book launch for Harold Cruz's book, The Crisis of a Negro Intellectual. The professor you had on earlier has written very much about Cruz's journey from the left to nationalism, but most importantly, the question of whether black folks who have the opportunity to engage in intellectual life have an obligation to the community, and what are the many strands of protest that have run through that. We were self-conscious about that. We had engaged with leadership from across the country, and we had engaged in anti-war activities, as well as engaging with a very indifferent administration, which included Jacques Barzun, who didn't, although he was a great symbol of Western culture, didn't want to talk to us about the deep issues. So we saw ourselves as part of that larger movement. Most of us evolved to some extent as that movement evolved. And the interesting question that's raised about talking about Dr. King is, I think a paramount question was, did we embrace King's philosophical commitment to nonviolence as a means of social reform? Because he was committed as a spiritual matter, both in terms of Christianity and the Gandhiists around him, like Howard Thurman and Benny Mays. Most of us had a much more pragmatic view and were prepared to entertain, at least theoretically, other possibilities.
Nancy, do you remember your involvement in the politics of '68 on campus as seeming to you like part of a cultural change that you were trying to bring about in the country or the world?
I think at the time, I think in hindsight, I see it that way. But at the time, we thought we were, that this was very much a political battle that we were fighting. A battle for stopping what we called and what we believed was an imperialist war, a war that this country chose to fight in to advance a theory that, communism would otherwise take over Southeast Asia, that Vietnam would be among the dominoes to fall, and we would be looking at a communist Southeast Asia, but for American involvement. And we said, no, what are we doing there? We don't belong there. Why are we shedding the blood of innocent civilians and American troops for, this ideology that we disagree with? So I would say that it was a very political decision on our part to oppose the war.
Raymond, in 10 or 15 seconds, do you remember how you felt when Nixon was elected president?
horrified. All of which was justified. You know, the notion that Ehrlichman later says the war on drugs was designed to marginalize and incarcerate blacks and protesters against the war, it sort of sums up the insidious use of white supremacy to suppress us.
And we're going to go out in this edition of The Eights, Nancy, with a clip of music from the time that you cited in your op-ed by Country Joe. Do you want to tell us why you mentioned it?
1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam.
Well, come on, all of you big, strong men. Uncle Sam needs your help again. Yeah, he's got himself in a terrible jam. Way down yonder in Vietnam. So put down your books and pick up a gun. Gonna have a whole lot of fun.
And what Nancy Bieberman wrote in her Times op-ed was the hopeful Dylan early 60s kinds of songs gave way to this more cynical music by 1968. So we thank Nancy Bieberman and we thank Raymond Brown for joining us on the Brian Lehrer Show.
On Wall Street, don't be slow. Why, man, this war a go-go. There's plenty good money to be made by supplying the army with the tools of his trade. Just hope and pray that if they drop the bomb, dropping on the Viet Cong. And it's 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7, 8.
Support for WNYC comes from